Okay, so it's this particular paper, Ideas and Graphs, the tetrad of activity, and this is what I'll be talking about shortly. But before I do that, I just want to do a little bit of additional self-promotion by mentioning this book my book that recently published, titled Elements and Relations, Aspects of Scientific Metaphysics. And this book also addresses ideas from Bennett and more generally from the work. And I maintain a website about this also, but I wanted to take a look at it, but looks like I can't get to it. In any case, this is a book that might possibly be of interest to people. But let me plunge right into the main subject of this talk, which is reconstructibility analysis of the tetrad. And one of my main areas of research in system theory has been on something called reconstructibility analysis, RA. And RA is of interest in system theory because it's a source of both ideas and methods. And years ago, I was at the University of Chicago, which had a famous committee on ideas and methods. So RA is both about methods and also about ideas. And the methods are methods of analyzing data. So in that sense, RA is a kind of machine learning. That's not of interest here. But as a source of ideas, it's about wholes and parts. How wholes are made up of parts, or parts are composed into wholes.
Are you in there?
Whoops, sorry. So if you look on the left side of this figure, you'll see lines and boxes. And in this representation, a line is a part. Let's say Bennett might call it a term, a thing, or I speak about it as an element, which could either be objective or subjective. It could be either. So let's say in Bennett's tetrad in the dramatic universe, the parts of the tetrad could be, or the terms could be, ground, goal, direction, and instrument. Or you could think of a family system of parts, say father, mother, child, and dog. So that would be another example of a tetrad. So this idea, this is basically graph theory. And a box is a relation, the way these parts are mutually relevant. I speak about that as a relation. So my terminology is elements and relations, and hence the title of my book. And that is, in fact, the way system theorists talk about systems. What is a system? A system is a set of elements and relations between the elements. And that's what these diagrams are about. So I said that a line is an element, a term, a thing, a concept, an entity, any of those. And even when the line branches, as long as it's not interrupted by a box, it's still the same element. And a box is a relation, and a white box, there's one of them at the top, is a tetradic relation. There are 4 lines going into it. So this top box is, as it were, the tetrad. the system property. A red box is a triadic relation. It has 3 lines going into it or coming out of it. A green box is a dyadic relation. It has 2 lines going in or out of it. And a blue box is, well, you could call it a monadic relation. It's really just the element by itself. So these are all the ways that you can organize 4 things, 4 elements, whatever they are, without distinguishing between different types of relations. That is, things are either related or not related. And on this side of the diagram, without even labeling what the element is. So these are topologies. And there are 20 different topologies of 4 elements linked by relation. So let's look at one of them specifically. Let's look at the one that's circled here, which is a triadic relation and a dyadic relation. So this triadic relation could be, say, father, mother, child are related by some relation or other. And the dyadic relation could be the child has a relation with the dog. Or, if you wish, the triad could be ground, goal, direction. And the dyad could be a link between direction and instrument. So either way. Now I'm going to just talk about these elements as A, B, C, and D. So this particular structure, now it could be father, mother, child as a triadic relation and child, dog, but it could be father, mother, child, and father, dog. That is, any one of these lines could be any one of these 4 elements. So if you look over here, you see that for this particular topology, there are 12 different specific structures. ABC, AD, ABC, BD, etc., etc. And some of these topological types have only one specific instantiation. Some of them have 4, some of them have 6, and some of them have 12. So there are 20 ways that you can put together 4 elements link them by relations without differentiating between relations and without labeling the elements. And there are 114 ways of doing this and specifically label the elements. And every one of these 114 ways could be a different idea. So Bennett, when he talked about the tetrad, he talked about the system property, he talked about the terms, he talked about the dyadic, the first order linkages, dyadic relations, the interplays. And Tony is fond of talking about partition structures. So here is 3 and 1, that's a partition structure. Here 2 and 2 is another partition structure. But you can see that implicit in the inner life, as it were, as Tony just put it, of the tetrad are all these 20 archetypes, which have 114 instantiations. So you can, and if you go to the pentad, it's even much, much more. And all this is without assigning directions to the relations, to the elements. If you add directionality, you get even more. So in this paper that I am talking about, this paper reports the fact that in the scientific literature, I've come across quite a large number of examples of Bennett's tetrad, of his specific tetrad of activity, of ground, goal, direction, and instrument. And all of these examples have have a close relationship to the idea of activity or purposeful activity, and they all involve four terms that are close to Bennett's ground goal, direction, and instrument. So I was actually quite impressed by how ubiquitous this particular tetrad is. And it turns out that you can take all these examples that I noted and assign them to one or another of these archetypal topologies. So one example might be this structure, another example might be some other structure. And in bold are all the topologies that are associated with the examples that I talk about in this paper. So I'm going to focus on one very simple topology, which sometimes called a chain structure. You can think of this as like A is related to B, B is related to C, C is related to D, or these are all dyadic relations, but it could be A is related to C and C is related to D, etc. So this particular topology has 12 different possible specific structures, of which the ones in bold are the ones that I actually found examples of. And here are some of them. So here are examples of this particular structure. And here's the Bennett structure, and you'll notice that I like to put direction on the left and instrument on the right, and Tony has criticized me for this, but I have reasons. We won't go into them. But so here is one particular exemplification of this chain structure. It's a hierarchy. From ground, you go up to instrument, you go up to direction, you go up to goal. And it turns out that the sociologist, Talcott Parsons, he talked about a tetrad of action, very close to activity, and his terms were adaptation, goal attainment, integration, pattern maintenance. And don't be confused by the word goal and goal attainment. It turns out that goal attainment for Parsons was really his instrument. So this is a hierarchy, and Parsons talked about, he applied this to societies, etc., and he said matter energy flows up and information flows down. So this hierarchical structure was central to the thought of Talcott Parsons. I like to apply that same hierarchical idea to matter, energy, information, and utility. Now, here are two very different sequences of dyadic relations. Control. If you're trying to control some process, you have a goal in mind. From the goal, you look at the actual process, which differs from the goal. You then consult the direction or the theory component, which tells you what to do, and you give instructions to the instrument that hopefully brings the ground closer to the goal. So this is a different sequence of goal, ground, direction, instrument. Now, problem solving is like control, but it's a little different. You start with a problem, something amiss with the ground. Then you think about what the ideal would be, what the goal would be. You consult your theory, and then you provide direction. You provide instructions for an instrument. Here is an example that comes from Jared Diamond, who wrote about failures of societies to respond to challenges. And he starts with a failure of theory, of direction, failure to anticipate. He then goes to failure to perceive the problem, failure in ground, failure to mobilize your goal to do something about it, a failure to respond, and then finally a failure to be effective in your response. So this is yet a different sequence. Finally, you can talk about an evolutionary sequence, which might go from body to instinctive center, moving center, emotional center, intellectual center, or reptilian brain, mammalian brain, paleo-mammalian brain, neo-mammalian brain. This, I think, is the sequence of the evolutionary augmentation of centers or brains. And this is a neural net sequence that is similar. So now what you have here is something very much like Bennett's triads, 6 triads, like Bennett talked about 1, 2, 3, involution, 1, 3, 2, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 3, etc. So one of the things that Bennett did with his analysis of the triad is talk about sequences of the terms. Well, here, this is exactly the same thing, except it's for the tetrad. You can do 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 4, 3, 2, 1, 2, 4, 3, etc. And every different sequence can convey a different idea, like the idea of hierarchy, like the idea of problem solving, like the idea of evolutionary augmentation, etc. So basically, what I'm saying is the tetrad has at least in it the potential of 114 different ideas. And this, as I said, is even not considering directions, and that would even increase that number even more. So finally, let me leave Bennett's tetrad and just, Bennett's tetrad is not the only tetrad, as you all know. I mean, a lot of the discussion has been about very different tetrads. So I'd like to add one more tetrad to your list, which is comes from a thinker named Eugen Rosenstock-Hesse, which he called the cross of reality, which I think is quite an interesting tetrad. It's one that goes inner, outer, past, future. So inner and outer is a spatial dyad, past and future is a temporal dyad, and here you put together these two dyads, and this is what Rosenstock called the cross of reality. This was actually in his case, inspired by the Christian cross, although I must say I'm at a loss to see the connection, but that actually is how he came to it. So this, I think, is a very deep tetradic idea. So if you're interested, take a look at my JGB site for papers that relate systems theory to work ideas. And you might also be interested in my site on my book, which also provides access to the index so you can see what kind of topics are covered. And I would be happy to, if anybody has any comments or questions, to correspond by email. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. That's delicious. And we've got time for just 1 or 2 questions only, but as you say, you can correspond on email. For anybody sparking on something right now? No? They're all stunned, I think, Martin. Okay. Anyway, and to segue on towards Ruben, and it makes a nice balance. From Martin, we've got this sort of, we'll call it mathematical, analytical thinking. But of course, with Ruben as a pianist, we have an artist, and it's lovely to go and combine these two perspectives. Now, first of all, I'm going to say something which he will, I think, was dealing with himself, but I wanted to emphasize it. And that is to bring in a perspective which is not only moving towards the artistic side, but also historically. And the historical thing I want to introduce here, and I do believe, as I've said, Ruben will be, I think, dealing with an aspect of this, because his account will be largely historical. And that is this incredible structure of the curriculum in the universities, which obtained in Western Europe for almost 1,500 years. And it was composed of these two parts. One was the trivium and one the quadrivium. Now, the trivium was concerned, one could say, with words, because it's concerned logic, grammar, and rhetoric as its subjects. The quadrivium, the fourfold, was concerned with number, and so it included arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. And when you first come across this, I don't know if you'll be like me, but surprised to this combinations of things, specifically that music was included with the mathematics. But of course, most of you will realize this always in human history been intimately connected with mathematics. And for certain periods of human history, the musical structures were perhaps the basic form in which they understood anything, any phenomena in the world. So this is important to realize. But I repeat one thing, that is the trivium is concerned with words, and the quadrivium with number. And there are these two realities, a bit like, I don't know, I could say a bit the same as that between the what is known in these two different forms, as we can have this saying of Gurdjieff about symbolic systems, that the most complete had at least four factors in it. One was words, and letters, and numbers, and forms. And really coming across parts of this, and from what we got from Martin, and looking at the thing like the curriculum of study and intelligence of the Middle Ages in Europe. So just to feel this quality where you have this, such a difference, where you take a difference between words and number, that there, for example, in words you have to take into account the alphabet, and in the Hebrew system of language it's always intimately connected with number, and that produces this way in the Kabbalah of calculating numbers and the meanings of things and all that sort of thing, that richness there. But best of all, with Ruben, you know, who's a long-trained friend of mine, and he is now pianist and composer, and he recently brought out a compact disc set of the music of Thomas de Hartmann and Gurdjieff, which he tells me Spotify has reported 150,000 hits, which is pretty good. And I always recommend it to you. But let's enjoy his. And so we've gone from I call it the abstract, which is a simplistic thing of Martin, now to the wonderful sensuous world of music. So over to you, Ruben.
Thank you, Tony. Well, thanks everyone for being here and for inviting me. I see many people I saw before. Yeah, just a little comment before I begin. Well, I gather most of you might have seen the video I put on YouTube, sort of as a prelude for today's session, because I've seen quite so many views, and it was private, so it can only be you, I guess. I talked about many things about the recurrence of number 4 in music. Some of those ideas will come up through this I don't want to call it presentation, but just ideas that I'm going to share with you. The center theme of which I'm going to talk is about the birth of polyphony. And why the birth of polyphony? Because one, it's something that only happened in Western music the way it happened, and I'm going to be explaining a little bit why. Polyphony in itself is a system in music, and once it was born, and once it reached the idea of four voices harmonizing together, that became sort of the canon for the future in terms of equilibrium and balance. And it's been like that until today. We consider in a choir, for example, the perfect equilibrium is four voices. Johann Sebastian Bach, most of his fugues were for four voices. His choirs usually are for four-part division. The string quartets, which are the four voices of the string family, are considered among the most, let's say, intellectual, refined style in music making until today, or at least people in classical music kind of thing. So that's why I thought that would be a great idea. However, I'm not going to be talking exactly about how we got from one voice to four. I'll do a little bit of that at the end, but I thought it was most interesting to talk about the context that made that possible, how all started. And well, I hope you will enjoy a little bit. I'm going to be sharing some slides, and I'm going to be sharing also some music with you to listen to. Hopefully, will make you enjoy the session. Okay, let me share the screen now. There we go. All right. So the painting you see here represents the coronation by Pope Leon III of Charlemagne, King of the Franks, as the new Holy Roman Emperor. This was the year 800. This does not only represent a key moment in the history of Western civilization, but also one of the most important events in Western musical history. The title of Holy Roman Emperor was not only awarded by the Vatican due to the Franks' economical and military power, but also because prior to this coronation, they agreed that all Latin liturgies should be unified under the idea of one empire, one liturgy. Before talking about Gregorian chant per se, we have to make a distinction, since this was the chant which only referred to the liturgy of the Roman Mass. There were plenty of chants all across Europe belonging to different liturgies, since each cultural region had developed its own variations from this liturgy, thus reinforcing each one's cultural identities. To this wide variety of chants across Europe and the Middle East we call plain chants. That's kind of the generic name. These form part of a very long tradition which the first Christians inherited from the Jewish liturgy of the synagogues, which was fundamentally based on the reading of sacred texts and the intonation of psalms. As Christianity extended itself through the Roman Empire, the liturgy started to diversify, since it was being translated to different languages that were used within the empire, such as Latin, Greek, Syriac, Coptic, etc. And each region unified its liturgy around their own language. This extraordinary variety created a real compendium of Mediterranean musical art, from the Iberian Peninsula all the way to the Middle East. Here you can see a schematic map of the different liturgies that were around Europe, more or less 7th, 8th century. You can see on one side the Eastern liturgies, which had their own, which were kind of derived from the Greek and the Byzantine. We have the Armenian, the Syriac, the Maronite, which is what is actually Lebanon today, the Egyptian or Coptic, And then in the West, we have several liturgies which are a little closer together than the Easterns. The Benedictine, the Roman, the Ambrosian, the Gallican, the Mozarab, and the Northern African Christian liturgy, which was also quite important. All these chants had one thing in common. They all derived from the recitation of a sacred text. So it wasn't understood as music by itself, but as prayer. And that's very important. In a text by Saint Basil from the 4th century, he writes the following. When indeed the Holy Spirit saw the human race was guided only with difficulty toward virtue, and that, because of our inclination toward pleasure, we were neglectful of an upright life, what did he do? The delight of melody he mingled with the doctrines, so that by the pleasantness and softness of the sound heard, we might receive without perceiving it the benefit of the words, just as wise physicians who, when giving the fastidious, rather bitter drugs to drink, frequently smear the cup with honey. Therefore, he devised for us these harmonious melodies of the Psalms, that they who are children in age, or even those who are youthful in disposition, might to all appearances chant, but in reality become trained in soul. For never has any one of the many indifferent persons gone away easily holding in mind either an apostolic or prophetic message. But they do chant the words of the Psalms even in the home, and they spread them around in the marketplace. And if perchance someone becomes exceedingly wrathful when he begins to be soothed by the psalm, he departs with the wrath of his soul, immediately lulled to sleep by means of the melody. St. Augustine, on the other hand, defines a hymn as a song with praise of God. If you praise God and do not sing, you do not utter a hymn. If you sing and do not praise God, you do not utter a hymn. If you praise anything other than God, and if you sing these praises, still you do not utter a hymn. A hymn, therefore, has these three things: song and praise and God. Throughout these first centuries, oral tradition is key in sustaining the formation and transformation of the Christian musical repertoire. And this is because oral tradition has been key through history in creating cultural identities and sustaining a collective memory. Chanting and oral tradition served three main purposes. One, memory. Within a culture where texts have to be learned by heart, the coincidence in rhythm and accentuation between melody and text helped retain both with higher precision. Number two, amplification. The absence of artificial methods of amplification of sound, chanting was the more efficient way of making the text audible to big audiences. And number three, transcendence. Chanting allowed the listener to reach a spiritual plane that transcended the spoken word. All plain chants had two characteristics in common. They were basically monodic, with just one line of music that could be sung by either one individual or a full choir. And they were also presented with a free rhythm, something like a musical prose with no stable metrical pulse. I will share with you now a video in which you'll be able to listen briefly a few examples of different chants from different Christian liturgies across the Mediterranean, such as like we see on this map. You'll hear in this order, chants from Jewish tradition, Maronite, Byzantine, Coptic, Ancient Roman, and Mozarabic. There's just a little snippet of each one.
يروشلايم تشكح يميني Ak tembek evangelion aget savon
Isidore of Seville, who lived between 560 and 636, was an encyclopedist and historian, defined music as follows. Music is the practical knowledge of melody, consisting of sound and song, and it is called music by derivation from the muses. Since sound is a thing of sense, it passes along in past time, and it is impressed on the memory. From this it was pretended by the poets that the muses were the daughters of Jupiter and memory. For unless sounds are held in the memory by man, they perish, because they cannot be written down. Musical notation of classical antiquity had been totally lost by the beginning of the Middle Ages, and all music was transmitted by oral tradition. So, automatically, did medieval thinkers associate music and singing with the processes of memory that St. Augustine employed in a famous passage from his Confessions to illustrate his theory of time. Note that time is conceived of as a kind of moving point, representing the awareness of the present, that constantly encroaches upon the future and turns it into the past. It is not a measurable or a divisible quantity. Lengths of time are simply collections of successive and discrete nows, a sort of eternal present. This conception of time is integrally bound up with the ad quality of pre-14th century musical rhythm. The reforms of the 14th century depended first of all on the supplanting of this theory of time by the more modern one of time as a systematically divisible entity, a view that arose in connection with the invention of clocks. However, all the music that we will be dealing with today is prior to this event. The Gregorian or Roman liturgy, the one practiced in Rome, was obviously selected to be imposed all across the empire, since it was the liturgy which the Pope represented. Here began a formidable enterprise to transmit and impose the Roman chant through all regions of Christian Western Europe, an enterprise that would take a full century to accomplish its main objective. Local liturgies of Northern and Central Europe, the so-called Gallican Rite, had to be suppressed and supplanted by the importing chant of the Pope's Church. In the absence of a method of writing music down, the only means of accomplishing this was by importing cantors from Rome, who could teach their chant by habitual repetition to the Frankish cantors. The difficulty of the task was compounded by resistance. In order to persuade the northern churches the Roman chant was in fact better than theirs, it was claimed that Pope Gregory I, who reigned at the end of the 6th century, was actually an important reformer of the liturgy, but not, as far as we know, a musician, wrote the entire body of Gregorian chant directly inspired by the Holy Spirit. As a divine rather than a human creation, then, the Roman chant was lent the prestige it needed to triumph, eventually over all local opposition. The Carolingian propaganda that the Roman liturgy was composed by Pope Gregory VIII under divine inspiration is illustrated in a Frankish sacramentary that you can see that I'm sharing with you right now. The picture adapts a motif already established in illuminated manuscripts containing Gregory's famous homilies on Ezekiel. According to this vision, the Pope, while dictating his commentary, often paused for a long time. This puzzled the scribe, who was separated from Gregory by a screen. So he peeped through and saw the dove of the Holy Ghost hovering at the head of Saint Gregory, who resumed his dictation only when the dove removed its beak from his mouth. It is from such representations of divine inspiration that we get our expression, "a little bird told me." Such depictions of Gregory in musical connections all date, of course, from a period long after his death. The actual Gregory could not have dictated music under any circumstances, since in his time there was no way to write it down. Since the different chants from different regions had developed variations in ornamentation and small microtonal inflections, it was of tremendous need to create and develop a system of musical notation that could register all these different inflections, since in the process of transmission over the Roman chant across Europe, it was inevitable that certain idiosyncratic features from different culture would be added. So the original Roman chant ended up being established with mixed characteristics. Exuberant Oriental melodies diatonized and subjected to the discipline of a plain rhythm with no pulse. Gregorian chant would not only vertebrate the liturgy in all its aspects, including the Mass and the offices all the way up to the 20th century, but would also serve as the starting point to the development of polyphony, since the chant would be used at the beginning of an improvisation or composition. Styles, techniques, and composers would come and go, but Gregorian chant would remain in the collective memory generation after generation. Gregorian chant can be classified in different ways, responding to different criteria. The way it was interpreted, for example, we have the responsorial style, which is the alternance of a soloist with a choir, the antiphonal style, which is the alternance of two choirs, and direct style, which was either just a choir or a soloist. We can also find Gregorian chant depending on the kind of text. It could be biblical or not. And also depending on the number of notes sung per syllable. Syllabic chants are the ones in which we have one note per syllable. Pneumatic or slightly ornamented, 2 or 3 note syllable. And melismatic or highly ornamented, in which you could have many notes per syllable. It was very common to have chants with different characteristics in this aspect. I'm going to put on 2 videos now. The first is an example of syllabic and pneumatic chant, which are kind of mixed together. And the second video you'll see is an example of melismatic chant, very, very adorned. very, very adorned. Okay, let's pause right there. So Western musical notation, as we've seen, was born in its more primitive form around the year 800 during this newly set Carolingian Empire. This technology would gradually evolve through different technical enhancements towards the musical notation system that we know of today. And that would be practically perfected by the 17th century. So we can see it took about 8-9 centuries to develop all the way. Musical notation is to music history what the invention of writing was for history itself. Large, diverse musical repertoires could now be conserved for posterity and future performance, the musical legacy of a civilization. The Carolingian initiative was the first one to actually transcend music theory and enter the realms of musical practice. The earliest forms of Western notation appeared in the Frankish lands in direct response to the need to transmit the Roman chant to the north. These so-called neumes were borrowed from the markings used in rhetoric to indicate vocal inflections, as we will see later. Placed over lines of text, they gave at best an approximation of pitch and no indication whatsoever of rhythm. Such notation could serve only as a reminder to a singer who already knew the melody he was to sing. And that singer had to learn the melody in the first place by hearing it and repeating it until he knew it by heart. That is, by the rote method. The idea of being able to sing a melody one had never actually heard was inconceivable. Pitch was eventually fixed by means of the staff, first used in Frankish monasteries in Switzerland. It remained for trainers of choir boys to devise methods to enable a reader to make a direct connection between the sounds of music and the signs that represented them. Among these teachers, Odo of Cluny and Guido d'Arezzo were outstanding. Odo de Cluny made extensive use of the monochord, an instrument that was used the way one uses the classroom piano today, to demonstrate the intervals and drill them until the pupil had assimilated them. Here we have a picture, a diagram of what a monochord looks like. Let's see if I get it here. There we go. You see, this was a piece of wood with a string attached to it and a small piece of wood, triangular, that you could move around from one side to the next, finding the perfect intervals that the students were supposed to be learning. Okay, so this was the way that they could teach all the intervals within the octave, and this was the way they were trained in the beginning. The monochord, so you see how important it was in musical training. These are two diagrams from the 17th century in which a physician compared the length of the monochord to the cosmos on one side and the human body on the other, to the whole bone structure and anatomy of the body. Guido d'Arezzo was supposedly the inventor of the tetragram, although that's being put into question these days, and establish the names of the notes through a chant in which the first syllable of each verse is one of those notes. Ut, which later would become do, then re, mi, fa, sol, la, and finally the note si would come uniting the initials of Sancte Ioannis, Saint John. This is the hymn of Saint John the Baptist. And now let's take a look to 4 different manuscripts, which give us a great example of the evolution of notation, as we just talked about. Let's see if the slides are. Okay. See, so this is a Swiss manuscript from the 10th century. It is an example of non-diastematic pneumatic notation, which means that the neumes don't give you the notes. The neumes indicate the melodic contour, rising or falling, but not an exact pitch, as in modern notation. This type of writing is typical of monastic centers in and around St. Gallen in the Germanic sphere during the early development of liturgical chant. The score serves as a memory aid, reflecting a still largely oral tradition. So you see we've got the text right here, and on top all these little scribbles and that, which were taken straight from rhetoric manuals and had a lot to do about intonation and so. This next manuscript is a Benevento manuscript from the 12th century. In this example, the notation is already diastematic. The neumes are placed at different pitches to indicate interval relationships. And a first guideline appears, establishing a tonal reference. This was kind of the tonal center, is this red line that you can see. All right. This right here. So you have notes on top of it, low. The intervallic distances, I guess they had their own system to devise them. This was not far from perfect yet. Okay. Here we can see, just focus on the little thing in white in the middle of the image, how they transferred from those scribbles that we saw derived from the rhetoric, and how they changed into notation to devise notes. Okay, so that was just a second sort of development. This is a manuscript from northern France, from the 12th century as well. The notation on 3 and 4 lines introduces a precise representation of pitch. The 4-line staff allows for the precise marking of intervals and facilitates group reading. This format spread rapidly through northern France and gave rise to the square notation of classical Gregorian chant. In this case, we just see 3 lines, but in the next one, here it is. This is the final stage of this process. We see the tetragram that I talked about before, 4 lines, which is a square notation with a 4-line staff represents the fully developed form of the medieval system. Each neum takes the form of a square or rhomboid and is precisely placed on one of the lines or spaces. This type of writing, used in the Central Slavic area during the 15th century, remained virtually unchanged in Gregorian chant well into the Baroque period. Okay, so medieval musical composition started, as we have seen, with the composition of just one voice. However, new musical creations were rarely written down at the time of their creation. They would be notated once their reach, notoriety, and status justified it. Monodic composition wasn't just an exclusivity of the church, since profane and popular music began to take advantage of all the different technical advancements that were taking place in music. In oral tradition, it is said that poetry is inconceivable without music, and this is something that medieval culture inherited from ancient times, developing a wide array of styles and genres. Epic poetry is found from Homer all the way up to the English ballad and the Spanish Romance, giving us examples such as the Roland song from France or the epic poetry of the Nibelungs in Germany. Lyric poetry runs all the way from ancient Greece to the medieval poetry of the troubadours, the trouvères, and many others. Dramatic poetry, the predecessor of theater as we know it today, had its greatest example in medieval times with the liturgical drama and the medieval mysteries. We will now listen to an example of trovadoresque poetry, but beware, since popular music was not constrained by the rules of the church, the way we're usually allowed to have instrumental accompaniment and clear rhythmic patterns, which were in practice, although when written down most of the times only the melody and the text would be registered. Performance practice belonged mainly to the realm of oral tradition as well. Medieval monophonic composition also saw significant development in the realm of Latin literature, that is, sacred music. In many cases, these new compositions were successfully incorporated into the liturgy, the Mass, or the Divine Office, despite the fact that the liturgy was supposed to remain unchanged. The oldest recorded form of composition is the trope. A trope consists of a set of new text and musical segments, in some cases text only, that were interpolated at various points within a pre-existing liturgical piece, or a chant. Sequences share a similar origin. The monk Notker Balbulus from the 10th century popularized the practice of placing texts over the final extended melisma. That concludes the Alleluia of the Mass. This new composition soon became independent and gave rise to a new genre that was incorporated into the proper of the Carolingian Mass, the sequence. Later sequences are poetic musical works composed ex novo. Hymns are original compositions generally associated with the divine office and processions. Despite the antiquity of the texts and the hymn's position in the liturgy, it is believed that their melodies belong to a much later substratum and are, in fact, new compositions. The importance of sequences and hymns lies in the fact that they perfectly reflect the characteristics of Germanic musicality, a simple and direct style, syllabic, strophic, and diatonic, the antithesis of the elaborate Roman style. These new additions to the liturgy proved that there was a pathway within religious music to enhance creativity and search for new discoveries. This was the perfect context for the members of the Church to start exploring the avenues of polyphony through the ideals of Pythagorean philosophy in respect to perfect intervals. The first early experiment in the early 11th century was called organum, which was basically just adding a secondary voice to the plain chant in parallel motion, always at the distance of a perfect interval. In this image, we see one of those early experiments in still very primitive notation. And there you go. You see, you have the original chant, which is the line on top, and the line below, the interval at which you had to sing the second voice. Throughout the 11th and 12th centuries, the organum develops into different styles. We find the florid organum on one hand, which meant that the second voice that was added had to add melismas and ornament the pre-existing chant, and it had a sort of improvisatory quality. On the other hand, we also find the technique of the discantus, which meant that the added voice could and should go on contrary motion to the main voice. Of course, as long as the intervals between both voices were always a perfect interval, 8th, 5th, the 4th. Of course, if this model started to work for two voices, there was no indication for them to try to apply the same system with 3 and 4 voices, which they eventually did, as we can see in this manuscript, which is for 3 voices. However, in spite of these first evolutions towards polyphony, one aspect was still missing for musical composition to be able to grow exponentially as it did, and that was to search for a way in which rhythm could be objectified with precision. The first attempt to do this happened within the school of Notre Dame between the 12th and 13th centuries, which is where we will stop our journey today. They developed a kind of primitive system of rhythmic modes. Each mode is a small pattern of long and short note values, longa and brevis, as they would be called, and each one corresponds to a certain metrical foot. Long short, short long, long short short, short short long, long long, and short short short. Each one of these patterns had a specific name. The notation of rhythmic modes used stereotyped combinations of ligatures, joint note heads, to indicate the patterns of long notes and short notes. If you see those different ligatures, you see that's what I'm talking about there in the image. The reading and performance of the music notated using the rhythmic modes was thus based on context. After recognizing which of the 6 modes applied to a passage of neumes, a singer would generally continue on in that same mode until the end of a phrase or a cadence. All the modes adhere to a ternary principle of meter, meaning that each mode would have a number of beat subdivisions divisible by the number 3. Some medieval writers explain this as veneration for the perfection of the Holy Trinity. In spite of its simplicity, this is more than enough material for these musical adventurers to let their creativity flourish and establish the first building blocks of Western music for the next 1,000 years. So now, just to leave you with a little bit of music, I'll put one of the greatest pieces of four-part composition, one of the first by Perotinus Maximus, Perotin the Great, from the school of Notre Dame. This piece is called Sederunt Principes, is an organum in four parts, four voices. It's very long, so whenever you need to keep going, just let me know and I will stop the video.
It's so much to assimilate with. Martin and you, between you, have showed the complexity of this sort of region, and how there is so much complexity in musical forms and their development is equivalent to the scientific ones. So I'm going to brush on. We've only got 20 minutes left, and rush things, I'm afraid, and try and do something about the intractable fourth. The phrase "the intractable fourth" came from Gustav Jung, and it referred to his concept of the functions, mostly. It was born from there. As you know, he had a fourfold system, different from Gurdjieff's, which had feeling and thinking, and then thought and intuition and sensation. And he brought in the fourth one of this intuition. But the idea of the intractable fourth was all around that for any of us, out of these four, there would be some element, some particular element, which was completely suppressed or in the unconscious. And in that sense, was intractable. It was hard to find because it had been buried or excluded. In Jung, you get this notion of the discarded or forgotten or suppressed function. And this, in his scheme of things, in his analytical system, can lead to it becoming a shadow function, so to speak, which can operate on us in our lives in a very destructive way. But more general concept he had, which relates to a similar idea which Bennett had, in fact, was that he wanted to update, I could say, or complete the system, kind of theological system of the Christians, which was the Holy Trinity, and he looked for the fourth member to provide a completion or a correction. And this, as many of you will know, was the introduction, attachment of the Virgin Mary as the fourth female or feminine, I'm not quite sure which is the correct adjective here, element. And people have noticed over the years, of course, the extreme sort of gender bias in the Christian Trinity, and it left far behind perhaps one of the original inspirations, which might have come from Egypt, of the Holy Family, and reduced it all to male characteristics. But it was so interesting, to notice historically how in about 1,000 years, 1,000 or thereabouts, there began to come almost, it seems spontaneously, in various parts of Europe, a veneration of the Virgin Mary, which became stronger and stronger, until finally it had to be, to some degree, recognized by the orthodoxy of the Vatican. Though I mentioned Mr. Bennett in this regard, and I will refer you to his wonderful scheme, or I found it quite inspiring, though questionable, of the four cultures. As you may know, he had a very strong historical vision of these four cultures, and they were associated, and he derived them from or inferred them into the Christian Trinity. Namely, you have the notion of God as creator, which he associated lately with a location in Africa, nature of the sun in Egypt, and to some degree also Islam, and this intense focus on the oneness, the unity of God. Then there was the quite different approach which came into the more Indo-European culture and tradition and Christianity, and that is of the Savior. Of course, the idea of the Savior started with Zoroaster, and it has this particular characteristic of the involvement of the transcendent principle, God, whatever, in the actuality of human life and the joining with human life. That was, he associated with a strange idea. He associated it originally with a region in the Arctic Circle. This is because of a book by an Indian astronomer, Tilak, Arctic home of the Vedas, saying the Vedas, if you read them in a certain way, seems to suggest that they must have been composed by people living inside the Arctic Circle. And he went into a lot of historical research to see if this was possible. But that notion of the wisdom, of the insight being in the Arctic is a long-standing tradition. And you had amongst the Greeks the idea of Ultima Thule and the Hyperborean people and so on. Then the other one was, which he associated with the Holy Spirit, was the Great Spirit of Asia. And it's interesting. So he suggested that somewhere possibly in the steppes of Central Asia, there was this center for it, because he imagined each of these three cultures emanating from a center and influencing as they mixed in with each other and developing all kinds of variations. Now, what was interesting was that, well, what about the fourth? And he suggested most of the time that this could be associated with the Great Mother tradition. As you know, some interpreters of history like to claim or put forward the reasonable theory that the primal sense of the holy and so on was from the mother, the Great Mother, and this later got overcome by patriarchal societies. Now, I've always been struck how in Greece the Delphic oracle was first under the aegis of Gaia, who was the mother of the earth goddess, but then taken over by Apollo, who is a basic symbol of the masculine and almost science, you can say, astronomy and measurement and control and so on, more associated with the sky than with the earth. Now, this picture of the three getting its fourth to correct it, Jung reflected in his idea of this lurking unconscious element in us, and how it introduced something which was so much needed as a corrective. In general, this fourth principle, the recalcitrant fourth, is the way in which we have to integrate our unconscious parts in order to become a whole individual, a person. You may know Gurdjieff in his book, Beelzebub's Tales, in his first chapter, he just throws off the idea that the true consciousness is not what it appears to be, but is in our what we call a subconsciousness. So there is this enormous parallelism to various systems about all of this. Now, this is reflected in the scientific realm. So I'll show you just, yes, I'll show you. Peter, you just do the one of the flatland, which is item number 2. There we are. It just, the text doesn't matter to very much, but if some of you don't know flatland, I'll briefly describe it. It was published somewhere around 1890, somewhere about, by schoolmaster Edwin Abbott, and it became incredibly popular. I don't think it's been out of print since. And it was really in that time when a lot of people, particularly artists, were obsessed with the idea of a fourth dimension. So this is one version of the recalcitrant fourth, which can be broached. And their idea of the fourth dimension was not as it became under relativity theory, which was first produced in 1905 under Einstein, which introduced a new idea of amalgamating it into space-time. But no, it was not a kind of treating time as a fourth dimension, but looking for a fourth spatial dimension. Now, this idea, excuse me, as I said, caught hold of many artists, including Picasso and Braque, but it also eventually seeped into literature, like in the very modern novel called the Alexandria Quartet. You have a series of events and you portray them from 4 different perspectives. And this notion of the fourfold perspectives is absolutely recurrent in many systems of looking at the possibilities. And now I'll do a little distraction from taking that word possibilities. You see, this is what you find is something which can, when you first come across my thinking, why should I bother with all these possibilities? I want to find out the one which is actually working. And this has been operative in science a lot, because there's a side of which says we shouldn't. Why should we deal with these possibilities? Our universe is only of one particular kind, and so we can exclude a lot of these possibilities. But more and more, it's found that these possibilities do have a reality, and you investigate these possibilities because you might discover something new. And in this respect, we can remember the example of Paul Dirac, who actually was a Bristolian like me. He went to the same school as Cary Grant in Bristol, but he was an extraordinary man in himself, and he was renowned for not saying very much. But he also used to say he produced an equation which physicists are likely to swoon over, called the Dirac equation. And he called this one of the most beautiful equations ever done. And he said it was more important for an equation to be beautiful than actually empirically true. But anyway, so there was all of that. Now, this fourth dimension of space, as they influence here in this one, you can see some very important idea. His novel Flatland was about creatures living in a 2-dimensional world, and this part of this story tells about a sphere from a 3-dimensional world passing through that 2-dimensional world. And what would they experience? First of all, they see a little spot, then we get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then they would shrink away again. And for them, it would be a miracle. And this is always extended. The whole metaphor was extended to say this is probably what miracles are. They're like manifestations of a 4th dimension. into our three-dimensional world. But this can be extended in all many ways. And you can go back to the basics, and I was talking to Peter earlier about this, and you get a spot. It's got zero-dimensional thing in it. Excuse me. Then you extend it, and you get a line. And you move these lines sideways, and you get a plane. Then you go move the plane sideways, and you get a cube. Then you say, what do you do next? There's no other room left to extend it. So there was a man, particularly extraordinary man, who had a great influence on Mr. Bennett, I believe, called Charles Hinton. And he spent a lot of his time devising all sorts of exercises where people could actually visualize the fourth dimension. Now, this was taken up by some artists, and could you show the next one, which is the cubism one, please? There he is. That's right. You see it now. Because people like Picasso were, in a sense, almost jealous of relativity theory and things like that. They wanted to do something as equivalently insightful and extraordinary as we were finding in physics. And they were trying to compete with the physicists, so to speak. And there was this notion in cubism that you could take all these. It's like, imagine you've got an object in three-dimensional space. You can only look at it from one side in our three-dimensional space. And imagine taking as somebody does in making a hologram. You take photographs from all possible sides and assemble them into this kind of strange artifact going on. And in this case, it goes the other way. That is to say, you can get it into a hologram. So this surface contains all the information of the three dimensions. And for me, it's always a totally extraordinary experience to go and see an exhibition of holograms. I think it's quite miraculous. But imagine in the cubist picture like this, what he's trying to do is showing the same thing from all directions all at once. And this is what they try to do. Now let's go on to the next one, the hypercube. Okay, this is one work by a jazzy version of a model made by Hinton of showing a hypercube, as it's called, a kind of cube-like extension, but in 4 dimensions. But there's always this possibility known in science about you can get something in a higher dimension which can project into a form in a lower dimension. And you can get it in the opposite direction too, as in this question of this extraordinary aspect of a black hole, that the information which is in the black hole is only on the surface of the event horizon. And you see, and there's this extraordinary sense of, you say, actually we're living in this, it's what's really the world is sort of encoded in this two-dimensional surface. But here, let me go to the second one after that, hypercube 2. This is another model made of it. And I don't know if you can picture in your minds, if you take a cube, a paper cube, and cut it out, lay it out, you get something like this. And imagine, if you can picture it, each of these placed cubes there was just a flat part. And so it's an extension of the idea of undoing a cube. Now, this would put into some beautiful effect. And the next one, please, Peter, which of course Dali's extraordinary picture of Christ, because he's on a depiction of a hypercube. That's a projection from the fourth dimension into this world. Now just one more part I'll show. The next one here. Come on. Yes, thank you very much. Which is called a stereogram, or sometimes an auto-stereogram. Those who know it will know it as a magic eye. And if you sort of refocus your eyes, I can no longer do it. I used to be able to do it. You will suddenly find a whole three-dimensional object comes out of it. The sense of this fourth dimension in space also influenced Svenski greatly, and it was it's still around, so to speak. And it's so interesting that artists of various ilks and various media try to find expression of it. And this is important. I think it's important. There's growing, I think, cooperation between art and science. You know, art is about depiction, expression, and so on, and science about reflection and assimilation. But they are very good brother and sister in some respects. Now, I want to show another aspect. I goes give myself a few 5 minutes. Now this can take us back, in fact, to Wolfgang Pauli, and I'll introduce in my hurried catching up mode about what he's. He was the person, you know, who worked with Jung, and it's a fascinating story. I don't know if any of you followed up a video link we sent some time ago. How his personal life was important for his science, because during the day he was a respected professor, but in the night he would go to the red light district and have fun with prostitutes, get blind drunk, and into fights. And you couldn't imagine he could have this incredibly weird, unsavory life, so to speak, and that's what drove him to speak with Jung. But one of the people he admired very much was the man who created this, which he's called Scotus Erigena, from the 9th century, I think it is. I'm not sure I got it right, 9th or 4th century. And it's so interesting how he was an extraordinary man. Bertrand Russell called it, the greatest intellect of the 9th century. Extraordinary man. This is called the divisions of nature, or the divisions of nature. And you can make it out that it is a tetrad. And what it does is extend our perception, our thought, our powers of reflection in a way which is all the tetrads really do, are concerned with that, of bringing you up to possibilities. You know, the one I often sometimes point to, which is, I can say it in words for you, see if you remember. You have A and not A, then you have these two special nuances, A and not A, and the last one, the most difficult, neither A nor not A. You think, what on earth can neither A nor not A be? But it leads you into this whole realm of creativity. But we get another form of this, and I'll read it through for you. Because nature that creates and is not created, which is God. You see, that's the creator, I think. But then puts on the side to the right nature that is created and creates, which is in the kind of metaphysical schemes of the time, we talked about these intellectual ideals which govern the creation of the universe. And by the way, I must throw in here, in my remaining grab minutes, this wonderful enigmatic statement by Plato in the Timaeus, when it was work which is really about the work of the demiurge and the creation of the world. And it's a very strange thing, because Socrates says, I see you are gathered together, and there's the first guest, our second guest, our third guest, but where is our fourth guest? And why does he put anything? Where is our fourth guest? Because it's the same thing of this elusive fourth, which we don't see, which puts it all together. Even in something as abstract as mathematical physics and or mathematical principles, like in Russell's Principles of Mathematics, which influenced Mr. Bennett a great deal. He said, well, there is this, we know from Charles Sanders Peirce that relationships, relatedness requires 3 terms, but when you get to order, you need 4 terms. And you think, well, how is this? I can't possibly go into the argument. It's basically this. You can get all the relationships, but an order comes in. There has to be this principal order, because it's coming out now in the way I speak or the way you write a sentence. It has to be in a certain sequence. And here I tell a story about James Joyce. James Joyce, I can throw in, because he was a great admirer of the philosophy of Giambattista Vico, the 4 ages of it, which influenced his work, great work, Finnegan's Wake. And there's a story about him when he was in Paris to working on the novel, The Physical Way. He said, "What are you up to today, Joyce?" And he said, "Oh, I've got 2 sentences to complete. I have all the words, we've got to work out what order they should be in." And this is always stuck in my mind because that order and that sequence is important. So it could all, but it also can be seen in the modern world about number two nature that is created and creates. It's also, in a way, well, kind of, all about us. We've been made, but we create. But maybe this is something we share with all life, so it can be updated. Now, 3 down there is like the dead world, nature that creates and does not create. It's just a thing, an object. And so you get the vertical axis is the extreme thing, God and matter. But then this fourth one comes, nature that neither creates nor created. Now, this is associated with, also you find it in Giambattista Vico, some word like risocco, is the return. And this is the returning to God as a God. God is the end, as telos. So you have God at the top as the beginning of everything. And here we've got God as the end of everything. And it was associated in this sort of period with the Holy Spirit. There is that. So, Pauli was very enamored by this, and because it related him, and why do I bring him here? And I just about squeeze that in, and I'll give you a rest from me. That is to say, when he, as a quantum physicist, was trying to solve certain problems, and at the time when he was working, there were established 3 quantum numbers, and he just knew there had to be a 4th. Why? Because he needed to find something which he later expressed as the Pauli exclusion principle. No 2 particles with the same 4 quantum characteristics can exist together, and you can't bundle them all together. They have to be separate. And this, what was this force? It was spin. And the introduction of spin is really the consolidated quantum mechanics and came from something which is also part of his dream world. And we'll end with that number 110, please, Peter. So it's also this, but it's number, go on. This is all what he did with Jung about synchronicity and so on. When it's an extraordinary idea, there's hope to create a new science. Next one. Okay. Now, this is a portrayal of Pauli's dream, which was Jung adored. So it's something like this. You see 4 figures there, and basically the 2 wheels are the vertical one is it's the cosmic wheel, and so on. And this is the horizontal one is the axis, so to speak, the actual world, and this intersection between this or eternal wheel and this became known in certain parts of astroarchaeology as this discovery of the precession of the equinox, which means about the breaking of eternity into time. And there's enormous amounts written about all of this, but you can just visualize it now in terms of the cross and think about the basic picture of some people have of the whole cosmos is as the cross, which has to be born, and in a way, which is to jump very crudely, to Gurdjieff again, is to the problem of lessening the sorrow of our endless creator. This rush through these possibilities, and we take it, I'll just point to some other things being why we have 4 forces, major forces, but the one enigmatic one is gravity because it's so weak and can't be quantized. You have the discovery that light is electromagnetic with Maxwell. He produced 3 basic equations for the work of Faraday, and then thought by looking at them just by patterns there ought to be a force, which he did. And this said there could be an electric current in an absolute vacuum, which led to the whole idea that light was electromagnetic. So I'm going to bring to a breathless halt my things here and just let's leave it all entirely. There's so much left unsaid. And let us have your ideas about what you would like to see to happen next. But embrace the diversity and celebrate it if you can. But it's always, you have to think into account this very important principle, which is very, very important. I'd say it's critical. See, we can always, we always get frustrated. We look, read all these books and whatever it's nice and read lots and lots of books. And lots of times I just don't understand at all what I'm reading and so on, the rest of it. I try to understand, but there's mistakenness in some respects. I'm trying to understand that by getting at it from the outside. And then it's all very difficult, because for me, this is me subjective, my opinion, it's the thing to do in learning or in studying, in getting these things which I call sort of psychedelic, which can explode, expand your mind. You see, you've got to face the barrier of your own way of thinking, and this is so strong in all of us. It's fixation. It's fixing us very, very hardly, and then I have to add something which probably you don't believe. I don't know. I can't anticipate you, but let's say hardly anybody knows their own mind and how they think. Yeah. And unless this is done, unless that is brought to consciousness, there's no possibility of changing the way you think, and you can only repeat. And over the years, I saw people with systematics, they would use the systems not to go into new realms, but to just consolidate what they already knew and give it a nice coating. So if you have to be brave and are a tough cookie, so to speak, have a bash, entertain these possibilities, but remember the capacity that you got one anchor in you, which is how you're stuck in a certain lens to look at the world. All of us, you see. And you have to take the possible almost as real as the actual, which is not a common habit to have. So there with a rushed explosion of breath. Thank you, Ruben. Thank you, Martin. Thank you all for bearing with me. But let us know your suggestions of how we can explore further this realm, because it's in a way it's like a madman's hobby, to do this, you could say. And some people have turned it into a business model which can help them function in their jobs well. But see how it ranges from this. Still glad to get these two extremes of Martin and Ruben in these two quite different fields, and you begin to see the intricacy of music begins to correspond to the intricacies of the analysis of mathematics. Anyway, amen. God bless. Forgive me all.